Good evening, everyone. I think most of you know who I am, but I'll just introduce myself. I'm Don Fisher, the interim principal. It's my pleasure to welcome tonight's panel. I'm sure it's going to be really excellent. For those of you that are new, and maybe there is the odd folk who are, do remember that we have an active program of events that happens from Monday through Thursday every week, and everybody's welcome. It's free and public, and more the merrier as far as we're concerned. I'm going to hand over to Helena, who is the host for tonight, and she's also going to introduce our panelists. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Helena Zaweri. I'm an assistant professor in the anthropology department here at UBC, and also an affiliate with the Center for Migration Studies, where I direct the Borders Research Group, which is also a co-sponsor of this event. I want to first acknowledge that the UBC Vancouver campus, where we're gathered here today, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and occupied territory of the Musqueam people. And this acknowledgement invites us to think about what decolonization and human liberation could mean in a world of borders, colonialism, and occupation, but also in a world in which our futures remain deeply interconnected, which are themes that are central to today's talks. I first want to thank Green College, and specifically Heather Muckart and Sarah Ing, for their support in helping us organize this event and for the invitation to have this event at Green College. And I also want to thank the Alireza Ahmadian Lectures at UBC for also helping to make tonight's event possible. They've really been instrumental in helping us to bring our speakers here today. I'm deeply honored and privileged to be able to welcome our speakers here tonight. I first heard about Dr. Omid Tofighian's work as a PhD student when I was living in Melbourne, Australia, doing research on the intersection between immigration, social welfare, and multiculturalism. At the time, around 2017, Australia was making global headlines for its offshore detention of asylum seekers on the islands of Manus and Nauru and its Stop the Boats policy. Targeted primarily toward asylum seekers who arrived to Australia by boat, Australia's official policy was that no asylum seekers would be resettled on the mainland. Instead, boats would either be turned back or asylum seekers would be detained on offshore islands, many for up to 6 years. I started doing some more research and learned about the work being done by detained asylum seekers on Manus Island and Nauru, trying to expose the harsh realities of a system that most people in the world had no understanding of. I learned about the writings and films of Behrouz Boochani, a Kurdish asylum seeker who had fled Iran for Australia and who had been detained on Manus since 2013, and saw that Dr. Tofighian had been collaborating with Behrouz on a number of film and writing projects. After reading more about their collaborative work, I was inspired by how their collaborations sought to break the boundaries of how we come to understand the violence of detention. It wasn't simply that Behrouz Boochani was testifying to his suffering, but it was also that he was conceptualizing how the prison works, its structure, its power relations, and what it means for Australia, a place whose origins as a nation-state are based on logics of displacement of Indigenous peoples and carceral approaches to convicts. And through Dr. Tofighian's work, I also learned about Elahe Zivardar's work at the time, and was incredibly inspired by her desire to seek justice for the inhumanity that unfolded on Nauru, where she herself was detained for 6 years by the Australian government. Elahe's artwork reflects on detention as a form of gender-based violence and as part of a larger border industrial complex. And through her work, we come to understand the weaponization of hope and time in detention. So I'm really grateful to be able to be in dialogue with Omid and Elahe, who have come from Sydney, Australia, and the United States, respectively. I'll give you brief bios about their work. I'll turn it over to them. They'll each speak for about 25 minutes. Omid will present, and I'll have more of a conversation-style format thank you, with Elahe, and then we'll pivot to a question and answer with the audience. So Omid Tofighian is an award-winning lecturer, researcher, and community advocate, combining philosophy with interests in citizen media, popular culture, displacement, and discrimination. He is adjunct lecturer at the University of New South Wales and honorary research fellow at Birkbeck Law at the University of London. His publications include Myth and Philosophy in Platonic Dialogues, the translation and collaboration with Behrouz Boochani of No Friend But the Mountains, Writings from Manus Prison. He is co-editor of special issues for a variety of journals, including Literature and Aesthetics, Alphaville, Journal of Film and Screen Media, and Southerly. And he's also co-translator and co-editor of Freedom, Only Freedom, the Prison Writings of Behrouz Boochani. I'll also say a bit about Elahe Zivardar. Elahe is an award-winning Iranian artist, architectural designer, journalist, and documentary filmmaker. She currently lives in Arizona in the U.S., where she obtained refugee status in 2019. After fleeing Iran, Elahe was detained on the remote island of the Republic of Nauru for attempting to seek asylum in Australia from 2013 to 2019. During her detention in Nauru, she was highly active in using photos and videos to document the horrific treatment and conditions endured by people seeking asylum. She's an artist who uses diverse techniques, including painting, photography, and documentary filmmaking, and she seeks to depict and raise awareness on how refugee, stateless, and migrant minorities are treated throughout the migration process, especially at borders. In addition to her artwork, she is active as an advisor to international refugee rights campaigns and organizations in Australia, the UK, and the US. So with that, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Tofighian and Elahe Zivardar. So I'll turn it over to Omid first, and we'll go from there. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for that really generous introduction and for making this happen, for inviting us to be here. And thank you to all the sponsors, all the supporters. So I would also like to start by acknowledging that I live and work on the land of the Darug people, which is now known as the northwest suburbs of Sydney. And this is extremely important, and thank you for your beautiful acknowledgement of country, because talking about border violence in the context of settler colonialism is extremely important to make the connection between the displacement, dispossession of First Nations peoples and what happens on the border, the violence that occurs on in relation to people who are trying to cross borders to achieve freedom and safety. So much of what I talk about today is going to connect the history of colonial violence with contemporary or modern examples of border violence. And because the theme today is creative resistance, the title, Narratives from Australian Offshore Refugee Prisons, Creative Resistance, Collaboration and Experimentation. Now, this really sums up so much of the work that we've been doing together. And one key term here is narratives. So much of the work done by journalists, by academics, by lawyers and other people who have taken more legalistic, more rational approaches, more data-based approaches to addressing the situation, often there is something lost or something doesn't communicate, or the objectives that people are trying to achieve don't end up are not arrived at in the way that was hoped for. However, one of the I guess the gaps maybe in these other approaches is the fact that the underlying narrative, the story told, the social or even the colonial imaginary associated with these particular kinds of border violence, the way that these examples of border violence are justified using a certain kind of narrative, that hasn't been addressed, especially in these rational approaches, these logical approaches, using data, statistics, argumentation to try to achieve, to arrive at change. However, using an aesthetic approach, which is inherently political, what we try to achieve is changing the narrative, changing the way people imagine the border and the people who are trying to cross the border. I'm going to start by playing a video because the images I'm about to show you throughout this presentation address some of the issues, really will give you a sense of the kind of conditions that we're talking about and the examples of border violence. But I think the video is important because it will allow some of the people who experienced immigration detention, indefinite immigration detention, will allow them to present their own accounts. Of course, Elahe will do that later on, but it will show examples of other people, and also it will give you a sense of the kind of environment we're talking about. That video was from 2016, after 3 years of indefinite detention. People were held on Nauru until 2023. There were people released slowly for a variety of reasons, but just last year, Australia started sending more people seeking asylum by boat to Nauru again, and the centre is being kept open as part of the discourse, a part of the regime of deterrence. Now, I think that video was extremely important because it not only shows you the conditions, gives you a sense of the kind of built environment, the natural environment, the isolation, the location of Nauru, but it also gives you a sense of the kind of systematic torture that was taking place, the different kinds of strategies, the different kinds of techniques. And it also gives a sense of the kind of fluidity of the border regime, how things are constantly changing, policies are changing, approaches are changing. It also conveys something about the securitization and the militarization of the island, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Now, I'm going to, the examples you see up there are examples of the creative resistance that we've been engaged in to combat the border regime, what we call the border industrial complex, which isn't just particular to Australia, but it's a global phenomenon. So at the bottom left, you'll see the cover of No Friend But the Mountains, the book that I translated, but I was also a collaborator on, and the book was sent to me by WhatsApp text messages. So I think it's the first ever book written using WhatsApp text messages. And these text messages were edited, I guess revised, rewritten, translated, and became a book, an award-winning book. It's won many awards. That was published in 2018. The image next to it is the film, Choka, Please Tell Us the Time. It was a book that was, a film that was, the shots were taken using a smuggled smartphone within the detention centre, and the film was co-directed between a Kurdish-Iranian refugee, Behrouz Boochani, in the detention centre, and his colleague, a Dutch-Iranian filmmaker living in the Netherlands. There, next to that, there's an image of Elahe from her ID card during her time incarcerated in Nauru, and a text in a very poetic way presented about her predicament, about her situation. Next to that is one of the paintings that she has created to represent different aspects of her experience. Above that, on the right, there's Freedom Only Freedom, the latest book that I co-translated and co-edited with Manus Prison. There are articles by Behrouz Boochani, but there are also articles by other people who have commented on the book, on the writing, and on the resistance, the creative resistance, which includes Helena and Elahe and Mehran, who wrote an article, a piece for that book. There's an image of by Elahe, a photograph taken by Elahe, and next to that is a render of her 3D model of the detention centre that she's been constructing after going to the US. These images are from my time visiting Manus Island. So it's important to identify these two locations as neo-colonial experiments. Nauru is a former protectorate, and Papua New Guinea is a former colony of Australia. Manus Island is one of the provinces, or Manus Province is one of the provinces of Papua New Guinea, and Manus Island is within Manus Province. Now, the detention centre in Manus is a former naval base, and many of the constructions, many of the buildings used are from World War II era. So, for instance, what you see on the left-hand side is a former airplane hangar that was converted into barracks, sleeping quarters, and about 150, 160 refugees were kept in that small space. And the image in the middle as well is important. It's an image of a local Manusian. And I think one thing that's often forgotten is the way that these kinds of centres, these kinds of forms of containment, also impact on the local people and disrupt their social, moral fabric, their customs, their history, their economy, and also, importantly, the natural environment. Detention centres are environmental hazards as well. There's an image from Cholka, Please Tell Us the Time, the film that I mentioned. Now, this is extremely important for understanding the way that colonial violence works, the way that the colonial logic that's employed in these particular sites. Cholka is the name of a native bird on Manus Island. It tells local people the time. Once in the morning, one in the afternoon. It's a symbol of Manus. It's a sense of pride. People always, when they hear the term Cholka, they know that there's a connection with Manus. The Australian authorities created a solitary confinement cell within the detention centre, and they named that solitary confinement cell Cholka. They abused the name, the culture, the history, the identity, the moral framework, the moral imagination of the local people, and used it for colonial purposes, for systematic torture. A lot to say about that, but also what's important is that the name of the bird in the film title reflects the way that time is weaponized in indefinite detention. And that connection with colonialism, the way that time is being used, but also the way that identity is stripped, architecture and design is also used as weapons, are reflected in the film and in the book, No Friend But the Mountains. One of the terms that Behrouz uses in No Friend But the Mountains to describe the colonial logic, the heart, the soul of the system, is the term the hierarchical system. Now, as a translator, this was almost impossible to translate. The term doesn't exist. System of hakem doesn't exist in Persian or Kurdish, and it's a neologism. And in English, there are different ways I could translate it, like sovereign system, system of governmentality, maybe dominating system, ruling system, controlling system, oppressive system. So many different ways, but none of them actually capture the intersectional nature of this kind of violence, the way race, colonialism, militarism, gender, disability, sexuality, class-based violence, religious-based violence, all of these intersect together in these particular sites. The best term I could find was one from radical feminist theology, the notion of hierarchy. So here is an interesting way of creative resistance functioning in the translation context, where a new term in Persian required a new term in English to be transformed, modified, to create a new term in itself, the hierarchical system. So here's some examples of Elahe's work, which she'll talk about herself, her upcoming film Architect, the painting series, Border Industrial Complex, and an art exhibition that we're working on, Weapons of Slow Destruction. There are one of her paintings, Nameless, and two of the images that from her 3D model of the detention centre. Another example of resistance from within the camp. One of the important things in our work in this form of creative resistance is to transform the image. As I mentioned, the narrative, but the images associated with that narrative. To transform the view that refugees are passive, weak, needy, supplicants, broken, pure victims. Moving away from that image, away from that narrative, and presenting refugees like all of us, in the diversity of their identities, in the kind of complexity of their identities. They're also knowledge producers, creatives, intellectuals, and so many fighters. In fact, by crossing borders, by standing up to this system, they're fighting for all of our freedoms. For these kinds of sites to exist, all of us need to be manipulated and exploited. And we'll talk a little bit later about this idea that there is a deep connection between the border and the state. What happens there, like I said, is a neo-colonial experiment. There is a deep connection between what takes place against non-citizens and what takes place against citizens. Some more images, and one that I thought was important to include here is the one at the bottom right. It's again a 3D render, and it shows the way that privacy is used, or the lack of privacy is used to, again, continually erode, continually strip people of their identity. Now, when it comes to human rights, privacy is considered a non-absolute right. But how can the law be manipulated and turned into a weapon? This allowance that is ingrained within the Human Rights Charter as a human rights principle, this allowance for privacy to be viewed or to be addressed in a flexible terms can then become a weapon where every year, every month, every week, every day, every hour, every minute, every second of your life is has lost all sense of privacy. And that's when it becomes part of systematic torture. So here are some of the ways that I've incorporated creative resistance into translation and writing. One, a form of experimentation, to really communicate what takes place in these sites, to really convey the kind of systematic torture and also the connections with colonial legacies. It was important that a form of literary or creative experimentation take place. Old models, frameworks, theories, concepts, examples didn't quite work. I mean, we were inspired by them, we drew from them, but there was something new, maybe unprecedented, about these particular sites. They mix in interesting ways the border industrial complex, military industrial complex, and the prison industrial complex. And this has only happened in the last few decades. So a new approach is necessary. Shared philosophical activity, the power of collaboration. Collective resistance is required for things to change, for the system to be exposed. So this sense of collaboration, I think, has also philosophical dimensions that we can talk about later. I call it a shared philosophical activity because it's a particular form of knowledge production that's created when there's a collaboration between people who are maybe, like me, formally trained in academic disciplines, for instance, philosophy, and people who are non-specialists. But in the same way that people inside the prisons, incarcerated people, require support from the outside, I also need support in order to understand, in order to engage, in order to convey. So there's this two-way connection, there's this interdependency, which also breaks the model of the victim-saviour dynamic. I'm actually learning more as a result of engaging in this shared philosophical activity. Anti-colonialism, and last point is horrific surrealism. And horrific surrealism is a combination of psychological horror and horror realism and surrealism, the anti-colonial forms of surrealism. So not just from European forms of surrealism, but also the kinds of surrealism that evolved, or introduced and then evolved in the Caribbean, in Africa, parts of the Middle East, which are deeply connected with anti-colonial resistance. That image from Manus Island, the image from the film Choker, Please Tell Us the Time, I think perfectly reflects horrific surrealism. We can talk more about that. I don't have time to go into it in too much detail, but maybe later. A journalist visiting Manus Island, another shot from the film Choker, Please Tell Us the Time, listening to local Manusians talk about what took place during World War II, the kinds of colonial intervention that took place, and how the existence of the detention centre is a new phase in that kind of colonial intervention. I'm going to read a quote by Chandran Kukathas, who I think really explains well this border nation dynamic, non-citizen-citizen dynamic, and how the small island, Manus, or the small island, Nauru, are deeply interconnected with the large island, Australia. The guns face inwards more often than they face out, and the guards are to be found not merely well within the boundaries of the state, but in every part of society. As we have tried to erect a fortress, so have we managed to build a prison. We have become used to living under surveillance, just as we are also getting used to monitoring each other in a panopticon of the people. Whether or not we fully realise it, we are no longer at ease. We rely upon a policy and a system that threatens rather than secures our freedom. Later on, he writes, the elite will come to tyrannize over the majority until it brings the majority to tyrannize over itself. This was important for me because my fourth attempt to visit Manus Island, I was stopped at the Port Moresby airport, the capital. I wasn't allowed in because I'd been blacklisted after my third visit. I was blacklisted, denied entry, and deported. I had done nothing wrong, and the only explanation was that the boss had given them orders. One of the things that Behrouz mentions in No Friend But the Mountains is that you can't confront anyone to get an explanation about why things are the way they are. The only response you receive is, the boss told us. This has come from the boss. You need to talk to the boss. Who that is never clear. The absurdity of that is reflected in so many different elements of this situation. These are examples of some of text messages that were communicated through WhatsApp. More examples of Elahe's renders of the detention centre. Examples of creative resistance. One of Elahe's paintings that ended up becoming the cover of a very special journal, Writing Through Fences, Archipelago of Letters, is a collection of works by about 150 people who either were experiencing indefinite detention at the time of writing or were recently released. The work spans from around 9 years, and from people in detention centres in Australia's mainland, Christmas Island, also a part of Australian territory, Nauru, Manus and Port Moresby, and also Australian-funded detention centres in Indonesia, what we call the carceral border archipelago. In order to resist this archipelago, this carceral border archipelago, we needed an archipelago of letters. We confront ugliness with beauty, and suddenly the narrative starts to transform. To finish off, I realise I've gone over a few minutes, but I'll finish now. This is being a philosopher, we thrive on thought experiments. We're always using thought experiments to try to kind of convey all the different dimensions, or to evoke intuitions from the readers, and then we sort of test those principles. I created a thought experiment particularly for this situation, to convey the kind of dynamic between the two islands. And I'll read the thought experiment, and the last part of it is on the next slide. So, please entertain the thought experiment. Imagine it is a creative act. So just please imagine that you're in this particular situation that the thought experiment is introducing. There is an island isolated in a silent ocean where people are held prisoner. The people cannot experience the world beyond the island. They cannot see the immediate society outside the prison, and they certainly do not learn about what takes place in other parts of the world. They only see each other and hear the stories they tell one another. This is their reality. They are frustrated by their isolation and incarceration, but they have also been taught to accept their predicament. News somehow enters the prison about another island where the mind is free to know and create. The prisoners are given a sense of what life is like on the other island, but they do not have the capacity or experience to understand fully. The people on the other island have special insight. They see things that the prisoners cannot. They create things that the prisoners cannot. And they certainly know things that the prisoners cannot. Some of the prisoners resent the people on the other island. Some simply do not understand the people there and try to undermine them. Some are indifferent to the other society. Some prisoners feel pity for them because they are confident that their own situation is changing for the better and will eventually provide greater freedoms. The two islands are polar opposites. One island kills vision, creativity, and knowledge. It imprisons thought. The other island fosters vision, creativity, and knowledge. It is a land where the mind is free. The first island is the settler colonial state called Australia, and the prisoners are the settlers. The second island contains Manus or Nauru prison, and knowledge resides there with the incarcerated refugees. Raises the question, who is in prison? We who are living in liberal democracy, or the people who are incarcerated in offshore detention centres? Whose freedoms are being lost? In a sense, it's all of us. What I'm going to do is play one more clip that reflects the kind of research, the way research and collaboration can evolve, can move into areas where creative resistance really culminates in something powerful, something special, something unique, and becomes a contribution to history, a history from below. This is a video involving people incarcerated in Manus. It's based on a lot of the research that I've done. I was actually one of the writers for this particular film, short clip, and it shows how some of the philosophy behind these arguments, behind this kind of resistance, can then start to play out in collaborative initiatives that involve people who are contained, people with the lived experience.
Authorities have confirmed the death of an asylum seeker on Manus Island. Friends of the man, who was a Sri Lankan Tamil, say it appeared he committed suicide.
After a Papua New Guinean court said detaining refugees was illegal
and unconstitutional.
Australia agreed to close the centre.
Over 600 refugees are still camping at the closed centre.
The Australian border is thousands of kilometers away.
But its real political boundary reaches right here.
We are not in Australia, but every element of our life is being dictated by Australia. Our life is being controlled by Australia. Our breath, our freedom of movements, our freedom of speech is being controlled by Australia.
Australians sing themselves relaxed and carefree, not slave owners, but in reality we are their slave.
It's not sweat from our labor that makes monetary gains.
Our time, our lives has been exchanged for a political capital.
Every minute, every hour, every day of 6 years. 6 years have been saved to keep politicians in power thousands of kilometers away. We are nowhere forward.
We can't stay here because we have no rights and we are not safe here.
We can't be taken to another nation because Australia won't allow it.
We can't go to Australia because we are worth more to their politician here.
We can't go back to where we came from because we will be killed.
We are giving Australia our best years as a political slave.
We could give Australia our best years as IT men,
as a veterinarian,
as a lawyer,
engineers and doctors. We are stuck here in Australia and Guantanamo for 6 years.
We stuck in Australian Gulag Island for experiment.
An experiment that whole world is watching.
To see how cruel the democracy would be with people.
If you were watching this,
in Western society,
allow your government to keep us enslaved.
Be prepared for your identity to be stripped for the political gains of others.
Or you can resist. We have been trying to make our voice heard for years from this island.
But we have been ignored by the Australian media and we've been ignored by the international community.
You, the free people in the world, you can speak for us.
Refugees are not criminals or illegal. We are just people. People who just want a safe place, live our life, and raise our families in peace.
Tell this to the world.
Defend our humanity or you may lose yours.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So we're going to move on now to a bit of a dialogue with Elahe Zivardar. Thank you so much, Omid, for that incredibly illuminating context. I think you've given us a really rich set of frameworks through which to maybe not make sense of, but explain the structural violence of offshore detention. I feel really privileged today to be able to speak with Elahe Zivardar, who is an artist, an architect, an activist, and a documentary filmmaker. And we're going to have just a bit of a dialogue about your experiences in detention, but also the way that you conceptualize those experiences and how you've used the medium of art and film to raise awareness and explain those experiences. So Omid kind of alluded to this in his presentation, but when we think about prisons, we think about spaces that confine people's mobilities and their bodies, but prisons also confine people's minds, futures, and senses of self. So could you tell us, to the extent that you're comfortable and want to share, how did the detention center in Nauru work to do both? Yeah.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for having us today. Do I need a microphone? No?
Whatever you want.
Yeah. My background is in theater and it's a kind of embarrassing to use microphones. even if I haven't been in theater industry for years, more than a decade, but it still feels like a bit. Okay. First, let's remember that when we are talking about the prison, we are not talking about criminal people. Nauru prison wasn't just a usual prison. It was where about more than 1,200 innocent people were taken randomly by Australian government. Omid, correct me please if I'm wrong, but just to give you some information about that, in 2013, when the Australian government passed his offshore policy, more than, I think, 4,100 people arrived by boat to Australia, but about 1,200 people were taken randomly and sent to Nauru prison island. And that included pregnant women, families, children, babies, infants, and very old people who were dealing with serious disease. Regardless of their health situation, were taken and sent to this prison. And in terms of the struggle and confusion and trauma that is related to places, I can say that it doesn't start with the detention center. We get there when we already have traumas that is related to places by leaving our home. We already have left our home, the places that we had feeling for. We felt safe. We had memories over there. We belonged there. And it's already missing, and we are struggling with that trauma and finding ourselves in a very unfamiliar place in general, regardless even of the structure and the design of the detention center. Now let's add to it that we were dealing with a very specific design that was meant to torture the detainee. What was the second part of your question? I'm sorry, because it's been...
Just how prisons work.
And it's, yeah, I'm sorry. And it's not just about the physical dimension of the prison. The way that everything was controlled, places that we go in each step, even inside the detention center, was divided. For example, this area is area 9, designed for infants, babies. This area is SAF area. SAF stands for single adult female area. And these areas all are gated. And even inside the detention center, isolated, in a very isolated island, we are still not allowed to enter different area inside the detention center. And place and time both are weaponized to create that horrifying environment, as Omid referred to, by horrific surrealism. We are already in that foggy environment that don't realize what happened in our life, that is been just upside down everything, and we find ourselves in this weird, structured prison, a prison that I always say, prison with no wall, in nylon tents, in tropical heat and humid, on a toxic environment, a toxic radioactive environment, because the detention center was built on a former phosphate mine, and it was causing people serious issues, health issues, from asthma to skin disease and even cancer. And a right to ask for treatment was being denied over and over. And I can say that even after the imprisonment, even now, after years of being free and resettled in the United States, that prison still is alive in our mind. That was highly smart design. So I think it's been working. And everything that we are talking about in terms of practicing art as a form of resistance, and all of our activism is, I don't want to claim that is just everything has been cured and we solved the problem and we are just sitting here and giving advice. No, I personally myself, I'm still struggling to work those trauma out and turn it to something or use it to raise awareness. And I know about other people, depend on the end of their stories. For many people, it's not yet the end of their stories. They have been transferred to Australia for medical treatment, receiving medical treatment or whatever, because being under too much pressure by international media or whatever, a very hard fight over the years. But they still don't have a visa, no have to right to do anything, and struggling with that limbo that we were living in.
I think that's a good segue into the next question, since you brought up the issue of resistance. So as Omid mentioned, you have an art series titled The Border Industrial Complex. And I was wondering if you could explain a bit more to the audience what you mean by the border industrial complex. What does it mean to you? Because there have been many academics who have theorized the border industrial complex, but you, given that you have this lived experience of it, what does that mean to you? And also, why is art and painting specifically a useful means to illustrate the violence of the border industrial complex?
Well, border industrial complex itself refers to a group of multinational companies who work and are contracted with governments to build private prisons and make money from torturing innocent people. So I can say this group of international companies are working together for financial benefit and also political interests, including winning election by using refugees as a threat, and creating those narrative, those racist agendas at the election times. And that is not just about Australia. I think that's a global issue that we'll get there, I think, in a few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. And increasingly detention is being privatized and kind of outsourced to these private companies.
Yeah, and also, about the paintings, from my own experience, because in a lot of cases, my series of painting, each painting refers to individual story and experience of my time. It wasn't meant to be border industrial complex series of painting, because I started painting inside detention to move on from trauma, dealing with trauma while not receiving any treatment. You don't have access to any psychologist or any services. So painting was a form of resistance for me, a form of therapy for me inside the detention center, because I was dealing with terrible nightmares, and we were just being prescribed to sleeping tablets. And this is crazy, because when you get sleeping pills, you will stuck in the nightmare. Before sleeping pills, you can wake yourself up. After you get used to a nightmare, repeat seeing a nightmare, it's a kind of reaction by brain. You can realize that you're seeing a nightmare and wake yourself up. But with the medicine that we were receiving, we couldn't even do that. So I prefer to not taking those pills and find another way. And I was starting the painting, and then it's been really educational even for myself, because at the beginning of my journey, I had no idea what border industrial complex is. The deeper I dig, the more I learn, and it became a series of painting years later through my years of imprisonment and years of advocacy. And I think art is the best way, because in a lot of cases I cannot share the nightmares when your memory and your nightmares and your fears all are mixed up, and you cannot distinguish them from each other, and add to it, the time is weaponized, and it's hardly difficult to keep track of time in a very highly isolated place. So even though in the painting I've been trying to use bright colors not to torture the audiences, because then the nightmares are horrifying and the stories are more horrifying.
Did we want to maybe show some of your work that specifically looks at how time is weaponized? Right?
Yes.
Because you have a few paintings that look at that. I think we have just a few to show.
This is my latest painting, actually, Amethyst.
Yeah. I think we have it up. Is this the one? Yeah. Do you want to say anything about this one?
Actually, in terms of weaponization of time, I would love to read the statement for this painting, because each painting has a statement to give some explanation about the story involved with the painting. And actually, this is very new. In my latest painting, I started making this hint video because it was difficult for people to see what is going on inside. And they asked me, would you explain about your painting and the way that you are telling a story within your painting? And I said, isn't that obvious? I'm sorry, but to me it's obvious, but it's not obvious to everyone. So that's the story of creating this hint video for my audiences on social media. And the statement. Time, time, time. My greatest treasure in this life and your greatest weapon against me. It has been a decade since my attempt to fly, to flourish, and your ruthless plan to degrade me. For the last 10 years, my soul has been the target of your hatred. Each year was a poisoned spear passing through my soul. But my patience and love are ancient. It can transform your spear as it itches my wounds, my purple pain, into a stunning amethyst. It reverses all your attempts to destroy me and my identity, then leads me to a place where I meet the truth about myself. I am an Iranian woman. I am Iranian, and our long history has taught us resistance in the face of cruelty and hatred. I am an Iranian woman. We are the weavers of the Persia's rocks from Tranj and Baharistan, among the oldest masterpieces of art on earth, thousands of years old. Oppressors come and go. Decades and centuries of shame or glory will pass. The greatest power on earth all disappear, but it is us again, women, the spinners of the spinning wheel, unbreakable alchemist. Oh, yes.
Do you want to show another one?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Oh, I think it's there. Does this one have a statement? Yeah. Do you have a statement with that one? Oh, okay. That's great. I think that was really powerful because you spoke to the ways in which, something that we oftentimes forget when we hear about the narratives of displaced people are their lives before this moment. And I think it was really powerful that you drew upon, your rich literary and cultural heritage that you drew from in order to survive and remind yourself of your identity and who you were. And as part of that identity, you're also a trained architect. And during your time in detention, you began to map out the space of the detention center. So I'm curious to hear more about what inspired you to do this, and also how does your film, Architect, expand this work of mapping detention, and what is your goal with that? Because I think it can be quite powerful to show the violence of detention through space and through mapping out the space.
Yes, I started first sketches when I arrived in Christmas Island. I was in Christmas Island in a quarantine detention center. This has been a lot of move. You arrive, they get you to a quarantine detention, which in that case was tent again, and then you are taken to another detention for a couple of months. Before I was transferred to Naro, I was in Christmas Island for 6 months. And I did the first sketches there, and then again in Naro. But again, it wasn't meant to be a part of a documentary at the beginning. It was just practicing or doing what I know, because it just required a pen and a couple of paper to do something with indefinite detention. You don't know what to do. You have a lot of time to kill. Why don't you go back and do something that you're familiar with? And this is so powerful in reclaiming my identity, because we will forget even our family member's name after a long time isolation. We didn't have access to phone or internet. It was an absolute isolation. Maybe 10 minutes each week, highly controlled, with a security guard that would hang up the phone, push the button if it would take more than 10 minutes. Everything was highly weaponized, even access to shower. Water was highly weaponized. We had just 2 minutes to take shower on that tropical heat. And the security guards were outside of the shower room, to close the tap if it would take more than 2 minutes. And it didn't matter if it was a 3-year-old child whose mother is trying to wash his head and is crying because the soap is still in their eyes, and they would laugh. They had a lot of fun with torturing these people. I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question in terms of architecture? I really apologize. I get lost between the stories. And yeah, it wasn't supposed to be a part of documentary. It was my attempt, like practicing painting or even writing poems or whatever I knew to remember who I am. Then it became a part of documentary. And from the other hand, let me explain that as an architecture student, in my last year of the university in 2012, before I left Iran, I was working on my final project, my final studio design project for the university undergraduate program. I was offering a facility with new function, open to public as a place of healing, where everything was designed to serve the resistant to find themselves, especially for people who are dealing with trauma or are victims of war or are experiencing PTSD or other kind of stressful situation that every one of us is dealing with in this world now. So it was interesting to me to study the dimension of prison, especially our prison, because there was something similar between my proposed facility and this prison, including a kind of isolation that was offering to people who are looking for peace in their mind, but not that kind of isolation. So it was very tricky, and I was studying the prison, every element, tents, the material, the location, that was really mean. I used to think that it was just because they didn't care, and then I realized, no, even picking the location was deliberate. Everything was intentional to depict a hell for us and make us believe that we've done a big crime and we deserve to be punished in this hell. Or go back to your home, go back to your country, to force the detainee to go back to their country. Even when they saw nobody is coming back after the first year, after the second year, after third year, they can't come back, but it was still going on because it didn't matter at the end of the day. The bank account matter, that how much money they are making, you know, it doesn't important that what is going on. So it was interesting for me to compare my idea of, it was called Aram Sayeshgah, the facility that I was offering. And all the spaces, special spaces in that facility was a result of months of interviewing people from different ages that what makes you feel better when you're experiencing trauma? How do you imagine such a facility? And the whole design was based on that research. So where were we? I'm sorry.
No, I think what you're talking about is really interesting. So creating alternative spaces to the prison.
Oh, may I add something? I just remember what I wanted to say. Yeah. Sorry. At the time, I've changed a lot. I was young. Mm-hmm. I was young and I was such a fool. That I was coming up with this kind of idea, and then I received a lot of comment that which kind of utopia do you think we are living in? It took me all of these years to going through all of this trauma to realize that we are so behind that, and I need to step back and first to start fighting these places of torture, the idea of prison, let alone it is for innocent people and children, and this kind of border violence. I need to keep fighting these kind of places. So it has been a complex of emotion, skills, experiences, and thinking over the years to use these kind of skills. Doesn't matter, painting, architecture, journalism, writing, filmmaking, theater. just to share the story and raise awareness, because it's a kind of dangerous cancer tumor who's expanding and taking over the earth.
So before we transition to Q&A, I wanted to pose a question maybe either of you could speak to, or you both could speak to. We've seen in recent months trends toward offshore detention being taken up by a number of Western countries, including the UK, which has this proposed nationality and borders bill, right? So Australia is not the only country that has outsourced the work of border violence or externalized the work of border violence to these offshore places or to resource-poor countries. Various parts of Western Europe have done that historically. Even the United States has used Guantanamo Bay and Guam as sites to detain asylum seekers. But, the UK has proposed sending UK-bound asylum seekers to detention centers in Rwanda more recently. So either of you or both of you, what do you make of these global trends, or how do you explain it? And how do you situate Australia within that broader sort of system of migrant deterrence? Omid, if you want to talk, or Elahe, whichever wants to go first.
I did expect it to happen because I was still in detention center when a group of people from Denmark came to visit the detention center. Some Australian politicians also were accompanying them to show their masterpiece of work, and then they can go and build a kind of similar offshore detention center for their own asylum seekers. So it really took the attention of European countries. But I don't know, it was not supposed that UK go ahead and, with them in being the first one who is actually doing this in such a scale, and that is so disappointing. And for me, because it's been a part of my fight for last 2 years at least, I can say, it's very complicated emotional process of every day that I hear new news. I get depressed, I might cry, then I get angry, and then I get motivated to do something else because it's happening so fast. And it is horrifying. And this is actually related to your other question. One of the most important reasons that I think our documentary is important to be made and be seen by the world.
Excellent question, and I think a good way to finish off the discussion before going to Q&A. I like to look at some of these issues by addressing first the material conditions, but then moving on to thinking about things more philosophically in terms of the colonial or the social imaginary, the symbolism. So first of all, in terms of the material conditions, the border industrial complex is extremely profitable. And I think politicians all around the world have realized that there is a lot of money to be made. Of course, they're spending billions of dollars to set up these sites, and all the bureaucracy involved, and all the different aspects of it are extremely expensive. However, the political capital that's gained is, I think, for politicians, it's worth it. So, and there's really interesting examples of how many of these companies are donors to political parties. So, the material conditions, I think, are important to address. How these different sites, not just offshore sites but onshore sites as well, play into the very right-wing, racist, conservative, exploitative forms of realpolitik. The other issue is thinking about it philosophically in terms of the social imaginary, addressing some of the historical issues. In order to convince the public, convince citizens that these sorts of places are okay, that these sorts of places can continue, you need to have a whole educational system, a system of propaganda. You need to perpetuate a whole range of different kinds of ideologies, and this means cooperating with the mainstream media, with the education system, with research projects. And this, again, fosters so many different benefits for people in power, for authority figures. And if you think about the situation culturally as well, it transforms, it turns the public, it turns citizens into, I guess, vulnerable or heavily manipulated voters. You know, by first of all, motioning people to accept these sites and to accept these policies, then you're able to then sell them a whole range of other things that are interrelated, that might not have a direct connection with border violence. I think it's fascinating that the former colonial outpost, the former penal colony, is now making an impact and teaching the centre of empire, the colonial metropole. That connection between islands, remember what I was saying before about Manus Island and Nauru making an impact on Australia as the nation state, as the imperial power in the Pacific, that connection. It's interesting that this island is also impacting its original colonial metropole. We can even go back further and see how the British Isles did the same thing in Ireland. All of these things are connected. It's interesting that there are always islands involved as this kind of almost natural prison. That anyway, I think in general, I think there's the material approach, addressing the material conditions, but also then the epistemic, the historical, the philosophical.
Let me add also, in Rwanda case, there are a lot of concern on military confrontation between Rwanda and Congo. And this is even more insane to send asylum seeker to a war zone. I don't know how to explain this and how it is possible, but it is happening.
Yeah, and I think what you both are saying also points to the ways in which the invisibility of these places gets kind of exploited, right? It's no coincidence that these detention centers are on islands, as you said, and that kind of cultivates this erasure to the mainland about what's happening. Like the general public is sort of shielded from it in this really strategic way, I think.
I remember Peter Dutton, the former immigration minister, said that there are no children in detention, when clearly there was children still on the island. By moving children off a particular site, and they were sort of partly in the community, he was able to present that lie because the island itself became the prison. Interesting how these things are manipulated.
Yeah. I want to give some time to the audience for questions, so we'll just pivot over to the audience, and if anyone has a question, please feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, there's someone in the back. I think. Do we need a microphone? Oh, we can, get one over.
Take a mic to the questioners. Who's going to start off?
I think it's one over there.
Hello, thank you for speaking with us. Wonderful topic. As something of as someone who enjoys studying philosophy, the thought experiment, especially at least the way I was listening to it, kind of building off the allegory of the cave. But it made me think of how here in Canada, we very much are people who still sit in the cave, still look at the shadows on the wall, and we're convinced that we're not colonizers, that we're free, that we love democracy. And it's hard to understand that we've made a prison of the mind for ourselves. And I'm both a Canadian person and an Indigenous person. It's hard to see as an Indigenous person to look upon these people that need to do work to decolonize their mind, which is work that I need to do myself. But they don't accept this idea. They're not colonized. Their mind isn't twisted in this way. They're not looking at shadows. They're looking at the world as it is. And it's hard to see it that way. And then also I'm the son of an architect, and just thinking about having just left that school and then go to this place that's designed in such an intentional way to be a prison. And these things aren't unintentional. Design is, especially, I'm guessing, with the the camp, it's very much of it is intentional. It's to dehumanize. It's to remove agency and to remove independence and to break the soul. It's hard to think as somebody who sees architecture so distinctly, but then to be brought into a prison, into a camp, and told you just have to stay here for an eternity, and to see all those dimensions of that architecture and how that built environment. I don't know if I've been able to survive the way you have and now create so much and be able to share it with us. My heart very much goes out to you. Thank you.
Thank you for picking up on the point about Plato's allegory of the cave. Just to add to that, you may be interested to follow up, but I was inspired to write that thought experiment after reading the philosopher Charles Mill's interpretation of, or kind of radical reinterpretation of the allegory of the cave. And he also connects his reinterpretation to W.E.B. Du Bois's metaphor of the veil. So, very interesting. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Zohri, for organizing this talk, and again to Elahe and Dr. Tofighian for your time. It's wonderful to hear from you, I guess, the second time this week, and as Dr. Zohri mentioned, a huge privilege. This is actually a question for, I guess, like primarily for, well, actually, you know what, for both Elahe and Dr. Tofighian, but I was actually interested, Elahe, I noticed in your art, the figure of the woman is constantly like featured, and I was just wondering if you could speak to what do you think is the hierarchical conception of the woman or the feminine versus perhaps what your art, or sorry, the art of other individuals who have experienced oppression, specifically, gender-based oppression. What is the anti-hierarchical configuration of women, and what is the relationship you see between womanhood, femininity, colonization, and systems of oppression, and what is your insight into that, and how does that come into your art?
So of course, well, firstly, of course, you can feel a lot of that feeling of, or expression of gender violence in my paintings, because luckily I'm a woman. And there were, and our detention center, even the place that I was detained was for women who were single and were traveling alone. And we had our own issues, a lot of cases of sexual abuse that I witnessed and heard. I wasn't leaving my tent that much, and I was trying to having a lot of interaction with guards or even visiting doctors. So I was just busy with the art and poetry, but maybe that's the reason that brought me some safety. But I witnessed and I heard a lot of sexual abuse and also gender violence by security guards, by even healthcare workers, or even some detainee in some area where families and single female were all mixed together, and also child abuse, sexual abuse on child. That was a prison with no privacy, as I mentioned yesterday. That was very tricky, because having a bit of privacy, it was a big nylon tent that was divided by nylon partition. So if you would try to lay on the wall, you would fall into your neighbor's room. So imagine couple being in this family, and they have their children, even in something private as like sexual relationship between couples would throw a fight in a whole tent. That was the way, the creative way of just not giving people privacy to lead them to more fights and to create the actual division between people who are all in the same prison. But what? You don't have that freedom, you don't have privacy, but you don't have freedom because the whole area is locked by tall fences. So this is a prison, but this is an open-air prison with no privacy. And again, the painting that you see, the women are referring to individual stories of what women experienced there, including abortion. I even haven't painted many of those paintings. They are just here and here because I haven't had the time and the energy. This is hard. This is so hard. Some of this painting has taken me a year to complete because I paint, I stop, I cry, I go and do something else for a while, and then I dare to come back and keep work on the trauma from where I left. I'm sorry if I missed any part of your question. And also women were so highly active and involved in this practicing resistance, including being the first people in line to be interviewed, photographed, and also attend in the protest. They had this courage, this womanhood was so powerful, that solidarity between women inside prison was so powerful. Oh yes, that is one of the photos that refers to that women's solidarity inside detention, being there for each other. And relationship inside prison, I can say, are much more stronger than one we have outside. We talk a lot about ugly issues. Let's talk about something beautiful, because well, I can say main reason is because there is no money or ownership in prison. People have nothing but themselves. So you'll see the most beautiful friendship and relationship inside the detention center that I loved. I actually loved a lot. Something that I'm missing now in my free life outside, and just witnessing bad things in our society. You're welcome.
Time for one or two questions?
Sure.
Thank you for a really wonderful presentation and a real demonstration of the importance of collaboration, of creativity, and of speaking truth. As you can probably hear from my accent, I'm Australian originally. I've lived here in Canada for 20 years, and being away, I have observed the ways in which the Pacific solution, as it's chillingly called in Australian political discourse, has become unremarkable and incontestable within mainstream politics. And so there's a strong consensus between the two major political parties that preventing the boats from reaching Australia by one means or another is the appropriate policy approach. I'm very interested to hear you both think about what the possibilities for changing that political consensus might be.
Great question. Can I start? Thank you for the question, and thanks for coming today. I'm going to go back to what I was saying before about addressing the material conditions and also the philosophical approach, the epistemic, the social imaginary, the symbols. So first of all, I think hope for the future in terms of a humane approach to people seeking asylum has to coincide with attacking this border industrial complex according to its supply chain. Cut off the opportunity to make money, to profit out of this, and these multinational companies will go away. The only reason they're there, the only reason that they function and they continue to be involved, the contracts continue to be signed, is because there's a lot of money to be made. I think that radical activism in this space needs to look more at follow the paper trail. I'll give you one example to illustrate what I mean. Until 2015, my superannuation as an academic was invested in immigration detention. And UniSuper, and to be honest with you, we're not really sure if they've divested. They say they have, but we're not. It's hard to really identify that. Imagine what would happen if academics, many of them who are against immigration detention, indefinite immigration detention as such, in any sense, imagine if there was a stance taken in terms of that and that supply chain was cut off. Imagine if unions stopped protecting or being involved, having workers involved in these particular sites. Imagine what would happen if doctors said that, you know, there's going to be a very serious radical approach to stopping these particular centres from functioning. I think that material approach is essential. The other one is the more philosophical. I think education, research, discourse needs to be there needs to be a saturation, I should say, of voices such as Elahe's. More images, more projects, more refugee-led initiatives, so that what we have is a saturation now in the media of the other side. You know, the kind of image of refugees, that particular narrative that I explained before of refugees as deficit, as, you know, infestation. These kinds of metaphors are used. I think the tropes need to change, and that involves a radical approach intellectually, culturally, philosophically.
First of all, thank you for spending the precious day of Nowruz with us, and Happy New Year to all three of you. And my question is, while you were in that creative mental process, which is very painful, and thank you for sharing it, were you able to concretize it, to put it down in paper, or to share it with your fellow other women? Could you talk about it? Or was it always sitting inside you until you found other means of expressing it? Thank you.
Of course. Thank you. Well, it is painful. It is difficult to share, and I personally usually avoid sharing a lot of that because I know it might be, in many cases, it might be very tough for other people. People have different capacity. For example, I lost my father when I was imprisoned in a detention center, and I was even avoiding sharing that feeling with my closest friend, and I would go and find, and it was really challenging to find a quiet place in such a detention center where there is no privacy, and everyone is suffering from serious mental health issue, depression, dealing with traumas, different kind of traumas, and we care about each other. So it was really difficult to manage how much to share, how much to keep, whom to share, whom to not. Because you don't know, your friend might leave you now and go and attempt suicide in a few seconds. And we are all caring for each other. And sometimes we are even hiding our pain from each other. But it depends on the situation. Even now, after years that I've been out, this is actually interesting because we always talk about it that it's a kind of, I can't say social anxiety because this is not an anxiety, but we have a kind of feeling. It might come from the lack of confidence that we think we are unable to build new friendship with people who have not been imprisoned. For example, in my time in Washington, D.C. as a journalist, I only could communicate with those journalists who had experiences of imprisonment. And I felt like, no, the other people don't understand what I'm talking about or what I'm feeling because they have never been imprisoned. But overall, when I think now and I go back, I think after experiencing the pandemic and after everyone experienced the isolation and quarantine and And that was huge for the war. It was a time that I personally was isolated too. And I felt, oh, now that I left the prison, the whole world has gone into a prison. So I think there might be some connection that people can now feel and understand, even despite they were just in quarantine in their own home, and they didn't have that struggle in terms of places and displacement. But still, that is something that separates us from the rest of the society. And even now, in this moment, I'm still trying to figure out how to communicate with other people who don't have the experiences of imprisonment. Thank you.
I just want to say, we've run out of time, but I want to say thank you so much again to Elahe and Omid. And I just quickly want to say that I personally feel very grateful to you both. I think your work allows us to see migration journeys in new ways, not as the end of people's stories, but as ongoing experiences of struggle, yes, but also of hope and future making. And I think that you all show that resistance can come out of this, which is born out of the need to survive, but also out of the desire to create new imaginaries rooted in equality, care, and healing. So I thank you both so much for sharing that with us tonight. Thank you. Thank you all for being here.